All right, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. All right, so this is kind of this was planned beforehand, and then Joel happened to have a tragedy struck, so this kind of is exciting in multiple ways. But cameras on, everybody. We have t-shirts for you for your annual Joel Hoxley presentation night, which we're all very excited about. And we have an extra one we can get for you. You can be super amazing. Oh, nice work, guys and gals. This is great.
Guys, I'm done.
Nice work, Joel.
Yeah.
Thanks for keeping it up.
Yeah, we really appreciate the effort you put in and to the talks, and it's a kind of extra special. You had some challenges recently.
Oh, guys, I'm so touched.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
And it's reusable. So we're going to do the 4th annual. And then we're like, you know what? If he keeps this up, we're going to need the 5th annual one. So
I will tell you, I was writing slides and I realized that I had 2 talks. So I started writing the 2023 one.
Yeah, there you go. So for anybody who have one of these, we did try to reach out to folks, but it's a tough coordination because Joel's on all the emails and Slack channels. It's like, how do you? But we do have extras. So if you want to get ahead of next year's talk, which Joel has already started preparing for because that's cool, we would love to get you a shirt. And they're actually pretty nice. It's kind of a nice like semi-tri blend or something. So. And not to steal our first speaker's thunder by any means, but we were all pretty excited, and a couple of us do have to drop off a little early. So it was like, let's go for it. So anything else that besides this fun reveal that anybody wants to talk about before I kick it over to Dan?
All right. Awesome. Well, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and Akira is going to be talking about how quantum physicists are leveraging light to break through to the next level of quantum computing. And Akira, I know personally, and they're a very curious human being. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. Please take it away, Akira.
All right, sounds good. Hi, everyone. My name's Akira. I talked here about, I want to say like almost a year ago, in a couple of Boulder RBA meetups, but it's good to see everybody again for sure. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, can you all see that? Yeah? Yeah. All right, so yeah, welcome to this little lightning talk.
Actually, I don't think
you can't see the screen.
Yeah.
Oh, you can't?
Yeah.
You can't see it?
Yeah.
All right. Oh,
There we go.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, sounds good. Yeah, so welcome to this little lightning talk. It's called You Light Up My Life. It's just a song stuck in my head, seemed to be appropriate. Yeah, and again, how quantum physicists are leveraging light to break through to the next level of quantum computing. Quick disclaimer, I am not a quantum physicist. I'm just very curious about this. Reason I decided to give this talk or even put this talk together is I met a person who actually works in this field recently. He married a good friend of mine, and we were just talking over dinner, and he started to kind of explain his work to me, and I was like, whoa, this is really fascinating, and I wanted to kind of have an excuse to get to know a little bit more, and then also I can kind of just understand a little bit more the kind of emerging field of computer science, which is really fascinating to me. But again, I have done my absolute best to be as rigorous as possible. But yeah, I may accidentally make a misleading statement. So if someone knows better than me at the end, or, you can always contact me on email or whatever and be like, hey, actually that wasn't quite right. I would like to definitely hear feedback if you know more about this topic than I do. So let's jump right in. Really quick, before we get into the actual photonic usage in quantum computing, I want to talk a little bit about some building blocks in quantum computing. The first is a bit versus a qubit. So in traditional computer science, as many of you probably know, we have bits, which are represented by zeros and ones, binary on or off. Qubits also have zeros and ones, but they also have what's called a quantum superposition of both states simultaneously. So essentially what that allows quantum computers to do is solve complex problems that are practically impossible for classical computers. Another way to think of this is a maze. So whereas a traditional computer would have to try every single way to get through a maze in order to find the one that actually works, quantum computers can kind of sort of do something like examine the entire maze at the same time and then choose the most appropriate path through the maze. The downside, of course, to quantum computing is that it's extremely resource intensive, and the qubits themselves are extraordinarily fragile, which we'll get a little bit more into in just a second. So let's talk a little bit about what's called fault tolerance, noise, and error correction. So a qubit has something called coherence, which is essentially its ability to maintain what's called a superposition state, which essentially is the state of existence. But it can fall apart quite easily due to noise coming from the environment around the qubit. So for example, this noise can be something like a control electronic, it can be heat, it can be impurities in the qubit material itself. And this noise causes quite a lot of computing errors that are very serious and can be incredibly difficult to correct. The reason there's a picture of beer here is because there's actually a good analogy that I read of from an article by a person named Tristan Green of TNW. He gives a great example of, for example, you are carrying a 6-pack of sealed beer cans of beer. That's okay. Like it's not too hard to lose information, aka beer, if they're all sealed. But the second you start opening them, you're going to start to lose information to the environment. So you're going to spill it. You might drink a little bit. It's going to evaporate. So that's the same kind of thing that happens with qubits, is they start to lose information to the environment over time. And what that is also related to is something called fault tolerance, which is a certain threshold for this noise. When a quantum computer reaches fault tolerances, that actually is, it theoretically is reliable enough to be considered useful. So let's talk a little bit about the actual now like light-based quantum computing, which is classically called linear optical quantum computing. So what is that? So the sort of textbook definition is this linear optic quantum computing uses photons as an information carrier and uses elements like optical instruments to process quantum information, and uses photon detectors and quantum memories to detect and store that quantum information. So to kind of break that down a little bit, to decompose that, the input of this quantum computer is a laser, just a very simple laser. And the qubits themselves are based on one photon. And the machine itself, as you can see here, is made of mirrors, beam splitters, and phase shifters. And then what happens is there's something called a single photon detector, which will read the results. So the photons themselves are the individual sort of qubits, and they are put through the machine, and at the very end, a single photon detector, so just a detector that reads one photon at a time, will read the results. Sometimes the best way to understand one quantum system over the other is to kind of do a quick compare and contrast. So let's do that really quickly. The Photonbased, there's some pros to it. The main one is that it doesn't need deep space temperatures in order to function the same way that other quantum systems do. Other quantum systems like ion, for example, need deep space like sub-zero temperatures in order to do anything. And the photon-based one, because it's based on light, instead of like ions or electrons, can actually function at room temperature for the most part. Because of that as well, it's also more scalable, and it can integrate into fiber optic infrastructure very quickly, which is very cool because you can actually modulate it with a conventional computer, which is definitely not readily available in other approaches. The cons is that it can be quite noisy. So also the photons themselves are difficult to get one photon at a time to go through the actual chips or through the laser, through the optics in the machine, without having all the other photons immediately die off. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening right now in the field. This is a company called Xanadu has actually created a photon chip, which is very cool. And I'll go over the actual photon chip here in a second. But what essentially this does is it allows photons to be put through a chip, have computations run on them, and then have an output that people can then display on their computer screen and do all kinds of complex computations on. I just want to check really quick. Can you guys see like my mouse, like my cursor actually moving around?
Yeah, we
Let me
can.
just, okay, perfect. Okay. So let's talk through this a little bit. So what happens right here, we're gonna start at the far left. Right here, conventional lasers, just regular lasers, are fired through into the microchip. Right here on these circles, these are called resonators. What they do is they generate something called a squeezed state, which is essentially Xanadu's version of a qubit. The light then flows here into this middle section. This is a network of beam splitters and phase shifters, which compute whatever you want it to do. So this is essentially a chip version of that very complex instrument that you saw earlier. Over here then, the photons zip out of the chips to a superconducting detector, which count the number of photons, and that would answer essentially the computation that you have put in. The only downside of this photon chip is that even though the chip itself can operate at room temperature, the superconductors that are detecting the photons that come out of it do still need to be in sub-zero temperatures. And I just thought this was really cool. It's really tiny, which is amazing to me. Xanadu also has the ability to actually have cloud-based quantum computing. It's not available to everyone right now. You have to request access, but it can do, I believe, 8, 12, and 24 qubit measurements and computations, which is very cool. A couple other things I wanted to mention with Xanadu is they have a couple of tools for devs. These are open source. The first one is called Penny Lane, and it allows you to do quantum machine learning on these machines they have in the cloud. And the second one is called Strawberry Fields. So this is for simulating, executing programs just on the hardware itself. It's a little bit more freeform. It's not just for machine learning. Then the last thing I'm going to mention really quickly is something called fusion-based quantum computing. So like I said earlier, there's a couple downsides to just doing linear optic, which is those detecting units that count the number of photons still have to be at a sub-zero temperature. So that can get really expensive and it's not the most scalable option. Also, there can still be a lot of noise. The photons can decompose or whatnot very quickly. So they're very difficult to capture. The solution that people are working on right now, which is actually what my friend works on, is called fusion-based quantum computing. This essentially builds a fault-tolerant system on top of linear optic hardware. So it has the advantages, again, of like having portability, being able to integrate with fiber optic hardware very easily, being able to work at room temperature completely without the need for having sub-zero superconducting detectors. But it's very, very new science. Where it's kind of at right now, if you want to learn more about it, is you'll have to read actually like published like white papers or published scientific studies. It's very, very new. But there is an excellent company called PSI Quantum that has a lot of really good talks that I did watch, but for me, it was a little hard to decompose yet into like explaining to people like myself that don't really know a lot about it. So I decided just to like let people watch the talks if they want to watch it themselves and try to figure it out. But yeah, it's very cool, and that will answer those questions. Again, it's going to have more fault tolerance. It won't have as much noise, and you won't have to use sub-zero superconductors to get the output of the photons. So that's it. That's my entire lightning talk. Just to wrap up really quickly. Again, the photons themselves are entangled and they're programmable, which is very cool. And the next challenge, like I said, is just to eliminate that noise. And then I had some further resources. I can post the whole screen, the whole slideshow in the chat so you can read more about it. And it's very fascinating science. So definitely recommend checking it out. And any questions, I'll do my best to answer. I know a lot of periphery knowledge about it, but if anyone has any questions, would definitely like to hear what you have to say.
Akira, I have a question actually. Like what are the use cases for quantum computing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So The biggest one that I encountered like as a pattern over and over again would be to have better cybersecurity measures, and also to be able to break like cryptographic tools that we use now. For example, like RSA would be completely rendered useless by quantum computing. A lot of the use cases for Xanadu that they at least mention on their website is using it for chemistry and for linear, I can't remember the name actually, it's linear something that is very useful for also like economics and finance.
Cool.
So we'll know that quantum computing has been achieved properly when everyone is hacked, like in one day.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, quantum computing, like for example, like there's a security, I'm not sure to call it the security protocol is the exact right term, but there's an encrypting protocol called RSA, which some of you are probably familiar with, where essentially you take two prime numbers and you multiply them together to make a third number. And in order to decrypt it, you have to find, like, you have to factor out the two prime numbers that were used in order to make this giant, like, third number. And a typical computer that will take something like 10,000 years or something like that. Google made a quantum computer that was actually able to use an algorithm that factored out a number into the I don't know the math term for it, essentially into whatever the two prime numbers were that were multiplied to make that number. The number itself was 15, so it wasn't like, wow, like 15. It wasn't like 1 quadrillion and 600 million, something like that. But it did prove that that was possible, and it did it very quickly. And again, whereas a regular computer would take a very long time to do that. So there's quite a profound amount of uses, especially for cybersecurity, for good and for bad, for sure.
Awesome, thank you. What about anyone else have questions?
It's like the most haunting thing I've learned in a long time. Like, I wonder, like, there is probably some nation state, like, real concerns about that, like, for all the companies you work for. Because as soon as whatever company figures that out, like, her country.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that I'm retired at that point. Doesn't sound like I will be, though.
No, it's hard to say how quickly this will happen. Like when I was doing my research, some people say like 20 years, some people say 50 years. AI is actually helping a lot with building the fusion gates on top of linear optics as well, because there were still a lot of issues with noise. So the better AI gets, the better the quantum computing gets, and the better the quantum computing gets, the better the AI gets, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's kind of scary for sure. And Dan, yeah, you're right. IBM does offer a lot of QC certs. That is correct.
Like, I have no idea what they're for. I just have gotten emails.
Totally. Yeah, they actually, there's an interesting YouTube series too that's just like about quantum like computing and like learning about it and trying to understand some of the physics behind it too, but it's definitely not for practical use. But like I mentioned earlier, there are those two tools that are open source that Xanadu does offer, which I looked at them a little bit. It's pretty interesting stuff. It's kind of cool and also terrifying. So yeah. All right, any more questions? No? All right. Cool. Thanks so much, everyone.
Question already.
Oh yeah.
Does Dan Bierman's question make sense, or is he trolling us all?
I think he's trolling.
Is there you said there's a package, but a Python package. Is there a
It's
Ruby?
Python.
Yeah.
Not that I saw. I just saw Python. And that was it. I didn't see like JavaScript or anything else, but again, that's my very limited knowledge. It's worth checking out.
Thanks.
And I think there is an active qubit. It's an experimental Rails library.
There's actually one photon.
Most of this performance active job.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate it. I'll put the slides here in the chat if you want to read more of those resources. And thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you. I knew it was a good talk because I didn't understand most of it. So thank you for the time and effort. That was